This is one of the hardest videos I'll ever make because in it, I'm going to lay out 13 brutal ways that my father, a malignant narcissist, tried to break me. Not just emotionally, but physically, psychologically, and socially. I was a scapegoat in a family with a mother who was a covert narcissist and a father who was a narcissistic sociopath. And as you'll see from the examples that I'll be highlighting, that wasn't a safe place to live. And yet, I'm still here, still standing and using my story to help others. My name is Elena, and if your father twisted your words, denied your reality, or made you feel like you didn't matter, this video is for you. Now let's get into it. Here are 13 weapons that a narcissistic father uses to try to crush his daughter's soul. Weapon number 1, possessive control disguised as protection. As a child, I didn't have many friends who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses. The scripture at 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33 was repeatedly used to discourage associations with what Jehovah's Witnesses call worldly people. And even though my father didn't belong to the religion, he definitely appreciated the isolation that it called for, and he encouraged my mother to join it when I was about 3 years old. Whenever I started to get close to anyone on the outside, my father would pick them apart and say negative things about their character, trying to undermine my friendships and destroy any potential outside support systems under the guise of protecting me. For example, just before my senior year of high school began, he called me downstairs specifically to tell me, without any basis, that my worldly best friend was promiscuous, that he'd seen her type before, and he predicted that she'd be pregnant before the school year was over. And he also said that if I continued my friendship with her, other people would assume that I was promiscuous as well. A few years later, when I got engaged and started planning a life with my future husband, my father resorted to his usual tricks, saying disparaging things to try and minimize our relationship. When I shut that down, he switched gears. He called me at work, and he actually told me that he had people watching me there and reporting back to him. It was like he was trying to claim ownership of me, like a dog who pees on a tree to mark his territory. And yes, it felt just as creepy as it sounds. When I started assembling the guest list for my wedding, I initially included the family who lived next door to us when I was a child. I'd babysat for them for years and I really liked them. My father intervened, telling me that he'd overheard them using the N-word and that I shouldn't invite them. Even though this went against every instinct that I had about them, I took them off the list to appease him. And I still regret that to this day because I know that what he said was a lie. Possessive control from a narcissistic father may not look like control at first. It might seem like concern. But make no mistake, what he calls protection is really about ownership. He isolates you from outside support systems, blocks any of your attempts at independence, and may even escalate into veiled threats when you push back. Over time, you're conditioned to second-guess your instincts and mistrust the very world beyond him until your life shrinks down to what he allows. That's not love, that's domination wrapped in false concern. And naming it is the first step toward breaking free from its harmful effects. Weapon number 2, rage and intimidation as tools of psychological control. As I approached my teenage years, my father started a side business as a photographer, and for a few years he ran it out of the house. When I was 12 or 13 years old, a friend of mine called my father's business phone and left a message for me. When he checked the answering machine and heard her message, my father flew into a rage, yelled at me to come downstairs, and told me to take my pants off. As I stood on the stairs in my underwear, feeling embarrassed and small, and wondering what I'd done now, he asked how my friend got his business phone number. I told him that I didn't know and that she probably looked it up in the phone book. He accused me of lying and told me to call her and ask where she'd gotten his number, and he warned me that if she said that I'd given it to her, he would beat me. When I called my friend, my father went into the kitchen and listened in on another phone. I asked her where she got his phone number from, and as I expected, she said that she'd found it in the phone book. After I hung up, my father came back into the room, told me that I was lucky that she'd answered the way she had, and dismissed me. No apology, no explanation, no remorse, just dismissal. When a narcissistic father uses rage and intimidation, it's not because he lost control. He's using his anger to maintain control over you. His outbursts are strategic, designed to keep you scared, silent, and submissive. Humiliation becomes a weapon. In my case, forcing me to take off my pants simply to show his power over me and to strip away my dignity. When you're on the receiving end of narcissistic rage and intimidation, you learn early on that telling the truth won't protect you. And over time, you begin to internalize fear and shame about your voice, your body, and how you show up in the world. Even into adulthood, that fear doesn't always fade. You may have a hard time relaxing, always brace for an ambush, and never fully at ease, because when you grow up with the threat coming from inside the house, you never truly feel safe. Healing from a father's use of narcissistic rage and intimidation begins by recognizing that this was never love. It was a pathetic attempt by a small-minded, weak man to control his daughter through fear, like the bully that he was. Reclaiming your voice, setting firm boundaries, and surrounding yourself with safe, validating people helps to rebuild the inner safety that he tried to destroy. Weapon number 3, hypercritical and degrading commentary. Growing up, I loved to sing. In fact, that and reading were my 2 escapes from the abusive family that I grew up in. I could get lost in either a book or a record whenever I had a chance. When my father heard me singing, he would criticize me viciously like he was Simon Cowell on American Idol.
You look a little odd, your dancing is terrible, the singing was horrendous, and you look like one of those creatures that live in the jungle with those massive eyes.
This despite the fact that he had 0 talent in that department. But when company came over and he didn't think I could hear him, he would tell them what a great singer I was, like it was some kind of a credit or source of pride for him. And when it came to women in general, my father was extremely critical, constantly criticizing their physical appearance and making nasty, degrading comments. A good example of that was when Janet Jackson began her solo career. I was a fan, and whenever her music videos came on TV, my father would mock her incessantly, talking about how she was chunky and needed to lose weight, when nothing could be further from the truth. He was also obsessed with women and how they aged, often talking about how women's necks showed how old they were. And because this was a normal occurrence in our house, the other male family members learned that it was open season on women and girls, and I was constantly objectified as a result. A malignant narcissist father doesn't just criticize, he dismantles. At home, he tears you down to keep you dependent, while in public, he praises you only if it props up his own ego. Your self-worth becomes something he owns, doled out in little bits of approval only when it serves him. He creates a constant undercurrent of judgment, eroding your sense of self and putting a little voice in your head that says, "Don't sing, you're embarrassing yourself," or "Don't wear that, he'll judge your body." And over time, he builds a warped definition of womanhood, one rooted in shame, objectification, and standards you were never meant to meet. But healing begins when we realize that our value isn't dependent upon the opinions of shallow people, whether they're related to us or not. Weapon number 4, invasion of privacy and boundary violations. With my father, there were no real boundaries, and my earlier example of making me stand in my underwear as he hurled accusations at me was no outlier. Often when I received a phone call, I would hear him pick up the other line and listen in. And when I asked why he kept listening to my phone calls, he would say that it was for my protection, and he would accuse me of being up to no good with no basis. For example, at the end of my junior year of high school, I was recruited to the academic decathlon team at my school, a prestigious nationwide competition where high school teams compete against each other in various subjects. Practices began during the summer, but my father insisted that the scheduled practice sessions were a cover for me to go somewhere else, and he blocked me from attending on more than one occasion. In one instance, when a fellow decathlete called to let me know about a change in the schedule, my father picked up the phone and listened in on the call. Then he accused me of enlisting them in my scheme. He never said exactly what my scheme was or what he thought I was doing instead of practicing with the team, and I ended up looking fickle and undependable, eventually having to drop out due to his constant interference. Of course, that was before we had cell phones, so today this could look like your father monitoring your text messages or tracking you with a phone app, not out of concern like a normal parent, but out of suspicion and a need to control your every move. A malignant narcissist father doesn't see you as a separate person. He views you as property. Your time, your conversations, and your choices all belong to him. Suspicion becomes a daily weapon, not because you've done anything wrong, but because keeping you on the defensive keeps you small. Your independence is sabotaged, your credibility eroded, and isolation becomes the default. But here's the truth. The moment you name this for what it is, narcissistic control, not care, you begin to take your power back. Healing starts when you draw new boundaries, not to please him, but to protect yourself. What was once invasion becomes clarity. What was once silence becomes your voice. Weapon number 5, character assassination and sexualization. When I was 11 years old, I told my parents that one of my uncles had raped me for 3 years when I was 6, 7, and 8 years old. After they accused me of lying, I provided evidence, and they switched gears and told me that it was my fault, that I couldn't hate him, and that I needed to be nice and respectful when he came to the house after that. A few months later, out of the blue, my father called me out of my room, and he told me that if any N-word, he said the word, came to the door, I'd sleep with him. It was as if he'd slapped me. I didn't know where that came from. But in hindsight, I think he actually thought that as a first, second, and third grader, I wanted to be sexually assaulted. A couple of years passed, and I was upstairs in a room at the back of the house ironing my clothes when a neighbor boy snuck up behind me, reached up under my shirt, and started rubbing my breasts. As you might imagine, I was pissed, and I kicked him out of the house. When I told my father what happened, he said it was my fault because of how I was dressed. I was wearing a tank top. And this kind of sexualized blame and boundary crossing continued throughout my teen years and young adulthood until I cut off contact with my parents 30 years ago. In both of these situations, my father didn't just sexualize me. He reduced me to a stereotype of promiscuity, stripping me of my innocence and assassinating my character when I should have been protected, affirmed, and made to feel safe. The way he spoke to me didn't come from love. It came from a need to dominate and degrade me. Even worse, the first instance happened just months after I disclosed being sexually abused by a relative under his roof. This wasn't just neglect. It was intentional psychological punishment for speaking the truth. In the second case, instead of reacting like a father should, with concern, outrage, or protection, he made my clothing the problem. He taught me that if I was harassed, violated, or sexually assaulted, it was my fault for being visible, for existing in my body, and for being a girl. When a malignant narcissist father uses character assassination and sexualization, he doesn't just damage his daughter's self-worth. He targets your identity. He uses shame as a leash, sexualizes you to strip away your worth, and projects his own darkness onto you so he never has to face it himself. His words aren't careless, they're calculated to break your spirit, disempower you, and steal your dignity. But here's the truth. What he said about you was never about you. It was about a miserable, flaccid excuse of a man who felt the need to obliterate his little girl's self-worth in a sorry attempt to build himself up. Healing begins when you stop internalizing his sickness and start reclaiming your name, your body, and your voice. You are not what he tried to make you believe, and you are allowed to rise and kick him to the curb. Weapon number 6, triangulation, pitting family members against each other. If you've seen my video about covertly narcissistic mothers, you know that my mother was incredibly insecure, and she actually thought that my father was having sex with me when I was a teenager. Spoiler alert, he was not. However, as I entered my teenage years, my father would make comments that seemed odd at the time, and in hindsight were designed to make my mother resent me. He would constantly say that I cooked better than she did, and one time when everyone was in the kitchen and I was doing dishes, he made a point of saying, "Elena will never have cellulite." That last statement made me very uncomfortable and self-conscious because it was clear that he was using me to make a dig at my mother. When a malignant narcissist father wants to divide and conquer, triangulation is his weapon of choice. He plants himself at the center of attention and creates conflict, honing in on weaknesses and pitting family members against each other, using carefully chosen words meant to destroy trust and control the narrative. But here's the truth. You were never the problem. His manipulation was. And healing begins when you step outside of his triangle, identify his game plan, and name it for what it is. That's when the cycle starts to break and you can begin to breathe. Weapon number 7, gaslighting and distorting reality. When I was 14, one of my uncles, my mother's youngest brother, set up a meeting with my parents after he'd run away from home and began living with the family of one of his friends. Just before the meeting, my father told my brother to bring him a baseball bat, which he hid behind the couch. He then sent me and my siblings outside as my uncle and his friend's parents arrived. About 3 years later, when that meeting came up in a conversation with my uncle, I asked him if my father had actually threatened them with the bat. He said no, and that he hadn't known it was there. A few days later, I mentioned the conversation to my mother. She asked why I told him about that, and I told her that I thought he'd known about it. When my father came home from work, my mother told him about our conversation, and he yelled at me to come downstairs. He was angry and he asked if I was trying to make my uncle crazy. Then he went on about how my uncle had recently been in a psych ward after his girlfriend dumped him and he tried to kill himself. He accused me of trying to trigger my uncle on purpose by telling him about the baseball bat incident. I told my father I'd never heard anything about a psych ward and I wasn't trying to make my uncle crazy. Then my father did an about face. He said the baseball bat incident never happened.
If I could only get inside that brain of yours and understand what makes you do these crazy, twisted things.
Gregory, are you trying to tell me I'm insane?
He turned to my mother and asked if he'd hidden the bat, and she denied it. He then asked my younger brother, who was visibly terrified, started to cry, and whispered no. He then got in my face and yelled, "Get the fuck out of my house." My father's reaction wasn't just anger, it was narcissistic gaslighting with 5 carefully orchestrated steps. And since gaslighting is an across-the-board tactic of all narcissists, I'm going to break this down so you can see how it played out. Number 1. At first, he didn't deny that the baseball bat incident occurred. Instead, he asked if I was trying to make my uncle crazy, deflecting attention away from his own actions and placing the blame squarely on me. This was meant to morally discredit me and reframe my intent as harmful or dangerous. Next, he weaponized shame and fear. He brought up my uncle's supposed mental health crisis and suicide attempt, breaking his confidence if it was true, not with compassion, but to paint me as reckless and cruel, someone who would intentionally trigger an already compromised person. Third, he erases history. We all knew that the baseball bat incident happened, but when it didn't serve the narrative he was attempting to create, he denied it outright, not just passively, but aggressively by saying, "That never happened." This is classic gaslighting, rewriting a shared event to convince you it never occurred. Number 4, he then manipulates others into reinforcing his lie, basically daring them to contradict him. And they fall in line. My mother denies the truth, even though if it hadn't been true, she would have said so earlier. My brother, visibly terrified, whispers no. My father used fear and intimidation as a tool to scare witnesses to the event into denying it. And 5th, and finally, after enlisting my mother and brother to reinforce his lie, he escalates to manufactured rage, yelling, "Get the fuck out of my house," and kicks me out. That's not parenting. That's tyrannical control designed to crush opposition, even if the opposition is just a teenage girl remembering something true. And on a side note, when I went to stay with my best friend's family, the same worldly best friend that my father discouraged me from hanging out with, my father threatened to call the authorities and have me moved to an orphanage. I wasn't even sure places like that still existed, but it was clear that he had hoped that I'd have no place to go when he kicked me out. Again, the goal was control. When you're constantly gaslit by a narcissistic father, the trauma is real and lasting. You might begin second-guessing yourself, your memory, your motives, and you might have a hard time making decisions. Speaking up becomes difficult because you begin to equate truth-telling with punishment and isolation. You become hypervigilant, constantly reading emotional cues and censoring yourself to avoid triggering another psychological ambush. And I included the following in my video about covert narcissist mothers, but it bears repeating because Mugatu from Zoolander eloquently articulates exactly how it feels to live in a family where you are gaslit repeatedly.
Anyone notice this? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
The goal of narcissistic gaslighting is to use the truth against you, making you feel like the liar, the villain, the unstable one, for remembering exactly what happened. And healing starts with learning to trust your own perception again, even after it was constantly denied. Journaling your truth, validating your memories, and surrounding yourself with people who honor reality are key steps in reclaiming your sense of self. Weapon number 8, negating your needs and putting himself first. Just before the end of my last year of high school, a close friend of mine died in a horrific car accident, and I learned of this the next morning at school. When I got home, I told my father that my friend had died. She'd been to our house several times, so he knew her. Instead of helping me with the emotional trauma that I felt, he interrupted me and began excitedly telling me that he'd just been booked by a new client to photograph a Viking funeral. I tried again to talk to him about it, but he couldn't bother to show the slightest amount of concern or care. He hijacked the moment to center his own relevance, his business, and his ego, leaving me emotionally abandoned during a situation that no teenager should ever have to face, much less face alone. A few years later, just after our first child was born, my father asked my husband and I to help with marketing and redoing his photography portfolio. By that time, I'd worked for him for years, from my late teens to early 20s without pay, even as he lied to clients in front of me, claiming that I was paid very well. When my husband and I told my parents that we would need to be compensated, they said, "We can't, we have a mortgage to pay," ignoring the fact that we had a newborn baby and our own rent to pay. This wasn't just selfishness, it was narcissistic entitlement, the belief that our lives and labor existed solely to serve them. The malignant narcissist father always puts his needs and self-centered interests ahead of yours, feeling entitled to your attention and support in one breath while using and discarding you in the next. But here's what he didn't count on: you standing up for yourself, you naming the harm, and you reclaiming your right to exist beyond his shadow. Your needs are real, your story is valid, and healing begins when you stop shrinking to make space for someone who never saw you in the first place. Weapon number 9, silencing the truth and protecting the abuser. When I was 21 years old, I found out that the uncle who had sexually abused me as a child had a son who was turning 3 years old, the same age that a younger male relative was when he was also sexually abused by that same uncle. Alarm bells started going off for me. I didn't want history to repeat itself, so I decided to write a letter to his wife, letting her know about his past as a pedophile and child abuser. When my parents found out that I'd written the letter, they told me that I was stirring up trouble, and they berated me until I agreed not to send it. Instead of showing concern for another child who could be harmed, they flipped the script and made me out to be the problem. And to this day, I regret allowing them to bully me into not sending the letter, but I also understand that this was par for the course. Shortly after that, I needed to speak with a relative who was staying with that same pedophile uncle. This was before cell phones, so I had to call the main house number. And when the uncle who abused me answered, I skipped formalities and simply asked to speak with the person who I was calling for. A few days later, I was visiting my parents when my father told me that my uncle had called him to complain that I hadn't shown him the proper respect when I called his house. My father got on my case, telling me that I was wrong and that I needed to apologize to the pedophile and that I should greet him respectfully if I called his house again. Of course, I didn't apologize to my rapist, and I never called his house after that, but it was clear that my pedophile uncle felt comfortable calling my father to complain, knowing that he would stand up for him while putting me in my place. And a few years before all of this, when that uncle got married, my parents sent my younger sister to California to attend his wedding along with 2 of my other uncles, all of whom knew that he had raped me when I was a little girl. No one cared what he'd done to me and his other young victim. Instead, they basically told both of us, "Fuck your feelings," and traveled almost 1,000 miles to surround him with support. The malignant narcissist father doesn't just fail to protect you, he aids and abets your abuser. To him, preserving the family image, defending those who hurt you, especially when they are men, and shielding his pride is worth more than your safety, your voice, or your pain. When you speak out, you become the problem, punished for telling the truth and trying to stop the cycle. He demands that you show respect to the very person who violated you because, in his world, power outranks morality and silence keeps things tidy. He rewrites reality until the abuser walks free and the daughter carries the blame for daring to speak up. But here's the truth. Speaking out is not betrayal, it's courage. You were never the villain for telling the truth. You were the light in a house built on secrecy and shadows. And that light is your power. So, keep shining. Weapon number 10, twisting your words and using them against you. When I was 15 years old or so, my brother and I were in the middle of an argument when in the heat of the moment, I called him a bastard. Overhearing this, my father confronted me and asked me why I just called my mother a prostitute. As you might imagine, I was confused and I denied calling her that, saying that we'd just been arguing and that I hadn't said anything about my mother. My father then made a big show of having me get the dictionary and look up the word bastard. He ignored the entry that defined the word as meaning an unpleasant or despicable person, and instead seized on the definition that means an illegitimate child born of unwed parents. He also conveniently ignored the fact that if we went with his interpretation of that definition, then he would in fact be a prostitute as well. And as he went on this ridiculous rant, my mother sat there, true to the covert narcissist that she is, playing the role of the victim who'd just been disrespected by her daughter. The malignant narcissist father doesn't just twist your words, he twists your reality. He takes an impulsive moment and reframes it as calculated cruelty, assigning sinister intentions where none existed. Then he steps back and calls you the aggressor. He hides behind manufactured distortions and false morality to scold you, all while masking his own calculated emotional violence. And the damage is real because when your words are weaponized, even your own voice starts to feel unsafe. But here's what he can't erase: your truth. Healing begins the moment you stop accepting his version of who you are and start reclaiming the power of your own story. You are not what he said. You never were. Weapon number 11, twisting innocence into shame. When I was a young teenager, I found a red light bulb in my house and I put it in my closet's light socket because I liked the color red and I thought it was cool. When my father saw it, he told me that the neighbors or people passing by our house would think I was a prostitute since there are places known as red light districts, even though I didn't even know about those places, and that was clearly not my intent. My father didn't just make an offhand comment. He attached sexual shame and public humiliation to an act that had nothing to do with either. And he expected me to internalize that shame. When a malignant narcissistic father twists his daughter's innocent intentions, he's not confused. He's projecting his perverted worldview onto you. He assigns a dark, sexualized, or perverse meaning to moments that were never meant to carry that weight. It's not about morality or protection. It's psychological abuse packaged as false concern. And what he's really doing is robbing you of your autonomy, your self-expression, and your ability to trust your own intentions. The shame, fear, and self-doubt that he plants isn't accidental, it's strategic. But again, here's what breaks the cycle: recognition. Knowing that his projections were never about you gives you back the authority over your own story. You were never the distortion, he was. And you have every right to trust your own instincts, speak your truth, and be fully you, expressing yourself freely without shame. Weapon number 12, lack of remorse and refusal to take accountability. Late one night when I was about 10 years old, my father sat down and told me that he never felt anything for us kids because when he was in the army in Vietnam, Vietnamese kids would run up to their Jeeps and they never knew if the kids were armed with grenades. So he and the other soldiers would hit them in the head with the butt of their rifles. And he said that desensitized him towards us and kids in general. Instead of addressing his sociopathic detachment or seeking help, he justified his lack of love, turning his experience in Vietnam into a license to abuse and emotionally abandon his kids. This wasn't vulnerability, it was emotional outsourcing. Instead of addressing his issues and stopping his abusive behavior, he essentially asked me to excuse it, taking on his experience from the war as my cross to bear. About 10 years after that, in my early 20s, I started trying to get my parents to take accountability for their behavior. As part of that, I told my father that I felt that the stacks of pornographic magazines and other explicit material that he kept in the house contributed to the sexual abuse that I was subjected to at an early age. I did something that few survivors ever get to do. I told my father the truth about how his behavior harmed me. In response, my father just said that it was too bad if I felt that way and that it was my problem if I couldn't deal with it. That wasn't disagreement. It was a cold, calculated refusal to even entertain the idea that his choices harmed me. There was no concern, no curiosity, no empathy, just a message. Your pain isn't my responsibility. When I finally went no contact with my parents 30 years ago, my father told anyone who would listen that I never thanked him for putting a roof over my head. When that didn't get a response, he ripped up photos of me and said that he didn't have a daughter named Elena. Now he and my mother explain my absence by telling everyone that I'm crazy, a final attempt to control the narrative. The common denominators in all of this: no remorse, no accountability, and no self-awareness. In short, a malignant narcissist will not say, "I'm sorry." He will not reflect. He will not own the damage he caused, even when it's laid bare before him. Why? Because admitting fault threatens the false image he's built, his fragile ego, and the hold he's had over you. And if you cut off his access to you, he'll become hyper-focused on tearing you down instead of engaging in self-reflection. That's not just a lack of love, it's emotional annihilation from a sperm donor, not a father. And if you, like me, have a strong sense of justice, it might feel difficult to move on when those who've hurt you refuse to take accountability. But healing and moving forward begins when you realize what you're dealing with, that you are enough just the way you are, and that you don't need validation from someone who lacks the inclination or self-awareness to give that to you. You are not crazy or ungrateful. You are brave enough to see the truth, and you're even braver for reclaiming your power and rejecting the false narrative that's been constructed about you. Weapon number 13, public saint, private tyrant. This final example can be incredibly frustrating and difficult to process. It's the malignant narcissist's secret weapon, the ability to maintain a polished moral public image while committing horrific abuse in private. To the outside world, my father seemed to be charming and upstanding, even going so far as to publicly state that there's never an excuse for domestic violence. At home, he was a completely different person, unhinged and abusive to everyone in the household. If any of us tried to help my mother when he knocked her down, he threatened to knock us down too, and he made it very clear that there would be severe consequences if the police were called. Even so, there were several times during my childhood when I woke up to police officers in the hallway outside of my bedroom. If our chores weren't done to my father's standards or he was just in a bad mood, he would drag all of us out of bed in the middle of the night and whip the offending child while the others watched. Being the empath that I am, I started confessing to crimes that I didn't commit to spare others from beatings. For example, one time when I was 10 years old, we were all called to the kitchen because a chunk of chocolate cake was missing. And my father said that if no one confessed, he would beat us all. Because the missing chunk was about the size of her tiny hand, I thought my 3-year-old little sister was the cake thief, so I raised my hand and took the beating. 15 years passed by before the youngest of my uncles, who was 14 at the time, laughed as he confessed that he took the piece of cake. He'd purposely done it in a way that seemed to point to my younger sister, and then he stood there and watched as my father beat me for it. A couple of years later, during one intense night of fighting, my father threw my mother off the front porch. After she ran down the street to a friend's house, my father came to me and he said that I would have to be the mom from then on. I was confused and I didn't know what that meant, but I just absorbed what he said, got up the next morning, made lunches for my 2 siblings, and made sure they got to school on time. I actually hoped my parents would get a divorce after that, but I later realized that their relationship worked for them in a way that I would never fully understand. The hardest part of having narcissistic parents with this kind of bait and switch, charming on the outside and tyrannical at home, is that they make you feel like no one will believe you if you say what's happening. For years, I tried to make anyone see what was really going on, but at the end of the day, suffering in silence and keeping family secrets became the norm. Living in a family like that keeps you on edge, hypervigilant, and bracing for the next explosion, and eventually developing complex trauma and associated health issues from the stress you internalize. Together, my mother, the covert narcissist, and my father, the overt narcissist sociopath, seemed to feed off of each other, building a malignant narcissism-fueled prison of silence that I eventually found my way out of when I decided to break the cycle for my own family moving forward. When it comes to breaking generational curses, the first step is recognizing that what was done to you was not normal and not okay. Next, it's about doing the opposite, setting boundaries, speaking the truth out loud, and surrounding yourself with emotionally safe people. You stop the cycle by no longer tolerating the behaviors that broke you, and by becoming the kind of parent, partner, or person you needed growing up. It's hard work, but believe me when I say that it's worth it and it pays dividends for the rest of your life. And if you have children now or plan to in the future, it resets the clock for them and gives them the life that you deserved when you were a child. So that wraps up my list of 13 weapons that the narcissistic father uses to try to crush his daughter's soul. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for making room for my story. And if this spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts and video topic suggestions in the comments. In upcoming videos, I'll be discussing additional topics from a survivor's perspective with the goal of supporting you and helping you to reclaim your power. The first step in healing from narcissistic abuse is in naming the behavior. So you may be interested in my video about 10 signs of the covertly narcissistic mother, which you can find here. As always, I'm Elena, and this is What Was Meant. Thanks for watching, and take good care of yourself.